Even if the heavens erase you, I will remember across lifetimes, through fire and silence, I will find you again. For you were never my curse, but the part of my soul that lived beyond death, beyond time, beyond the world itself. My demon, my love, my eternal beginning. I was born under an indifferent sky, destined to heights I never wanted and burdens I could never escape. My childhood was a palace of cold marble corridors and empty laughter, where every smile was calculated and every tear a weakness to conceal. As the only heir to a legacy of power, I learned early that emotions were obstacles, loopholes for enemies, chasms for the heart. I buried every craving love, friendship, warmth beneath layers of precision, surfaces glimmering but hollow. Years later, I stood on the rooftop of my company's tower at the edge of twilight, watching the city's lights sparkle like distant stars. To anyone else, it was freedom, possibility, the hum of life beneath me. To me, it was silence, the only constant companion I'd ever trusted. I felt the breeze but didn't respond, and heard the distant horns but remained still. I had mastered control, mastered the face I showed the world. I had even mastered myself. But control is fragile, and that night the sky betrayed me. It split not with thunder or lightning, but with a quiet ripping, as if reality itself had a stitch undone. Smoke curled through the tier, ash drifting down like sorrow. And then he fell. He was lifted from the rift as if caught on air, descending in slow arcs until he landed before me. Not graceful like a dancer, but brutal, heavy, like fate incarnate. The wind from his arrival rattled my bones. I sharpened my posture instinctively, alert, assessing. I had no room for fear. But when his head lifted and his eyes met mine, I felt something crack inside me. A fissure I didn't anticipate. He wasn't human. His face held both beauty and horror, carved of shadows and fire. His skin was pale, his eyes as dark as midnight, and his form radiated a presence that shouldn't exist in our world. I had read about demons, myths, fairy tales, corporate allegories, but none had prepared me for this. He exuded a calm so deep it bordered on apathy. But in those depths I saw something else. Exhaustion. Regret. He looked like a king dethroned and a prisoner at once. I should have run. I should have called for help. Instead, I watched him rise, slow and deliberate, and take one step toward me. My breath caught. I wanted to do something, but the world around us had gone quiet. Even the city seemed to hold its breath. That was our first moment. Two souls, one armored in steel, the other etched in ancient sorrow, meeting across a chasm of worlds. It took days for the shock to wear off, as though my mind had quarantined the experience. I avoided the rooftop and replaced the empty nights with meetings and errands. I pulsed with the knowledge that I had seen the impossible, that the sky had torn open and let him loose in the world. I couldn't unsee it. I couldn't unfeel it. But the universe doesn't forgive silence forever. He began to appear in the hem of my vision, in corners of boardrooms and on elevators, always present, always observing. I would sense his gaze on me, weightless, a demand for acknowledgement. I rationalized. He must be a hallucination, a projection of my exhaustion. I had a name for everything. But whenever I tried to concentrate, the air would shift. I'd feel cold where there should be warmth. The fluorescent lights would flicker. My skin prickled, alive to something I couldn't name. The air tasted different around him, sharp, like winter before the first snow. I found myself drawn to midnight wanderings, pacing my office, staring at the city's yellow lights struggling against the dark. And always, at the edge of my sight, I sensed him waiting. I thought I was safe until he touched my hand. I didn't react. I didn't pull away. I just felt. He appeared beside me in the rooftop garden one evening, though I insisted I had been alone. When I reached out to steady myself on a marble bench, his fingers grazed mine. Metal met marble. My breath caught at his temperature, cool, bloodless, otherworldly. We both froze. Something flickered in his expression, something like grief. I felt a pull deeper than fear, deeper than curiosity. I felt recognition, danger, and desire for a flood of contradictions. The world tilted, unsteady. Days passed, and the uninvited presence became a constant. He trailed me like an echo. Our worlds collided and coexisted. I learned that my phone would mysteriously power down near him. My security cameras flickered. My assistants reported subtle disturbances, footsteps in empty hallways and low rumblings at night. They said the building felt off. I said it was stressful, but I couldn't correct their perceptions. I had no defense. I began to chase him as much as he chased me. I set up cameras. I scoured hotel corridors late at night. I traced anomalies in the network logs. He looked at every advance with something closer to pity than fear. Then came the night of retrospect. I woke with the first image, not a memory of my own life, but of his. I stood in a field of ash and bones. I saw myself, centuries ago, face obscured by storm clouds, pointing at him as he bent, defeated. I felt the cold of blood, the shock of betrayal. I felt his suffering, the hunger in his eyes, the anguish in his throat. My heart broke before I knew why. On the rooftop, he appeared. I turned and faced him. For a moment, time hummed. He looked as if he aged in that single instant. His eyes glistened. And when I reached out, searching for answers, he didn't pull away. He let me touch his skin. It burned. My heart seized and I staggered. Then tears welled in my eyes. I had no control. I hated how I cared. I hated that something inside me breached. I hated this powerless version of myself. He gathered me in the chill of midnight air. My breath rose in the mist. And in that breath, I sensed a contract, a binding more powerful than words. We did not sign it, but the energy crackled between us. Something elemental clicked into place. The presence lingered in me, sour and sweet. I awoke the next morning, sleep fled me. My body throbbed as though resonating with his heartbeat. On the phone, my voice was calm. Inside me simmered a storm. I walked down corridors, feeling the walls were too close. The world felt drunk, lights pulsed, sounds echoed. I needed clarity. I needed the demon. I retreated to the rooftop. He was there, as if waiting. The sky was pale gray, the city breathless beneath us. I studied his posture rigidly, as though he did not know how to stand in sunlight. My fingertips brushed marble. Days earlier, that thought would have horrified me. Now it felt strangely familiar. I reached out again. This time his hand closed over mine, not aggressive or menacing, but alive. His pulse was cool and slow. We stood there, two beings bound by something blurred between fate and fear for hours that might have been seconds. We both felt it, unspoken, undeniable. Over the next weeks, our connection deepened in darkness. Without words, we unraveled each other's secrets. I showed him my loneliness not with tearful monologues, but in the moments he found me staring at my reflection, empty. He offered protection not with heroics, but by intercepting threats I hadn't noticed. A rival executive's sabotage attempt fizzled. A late-night intruder paused and fled. I never saw him move, but the results spoke of uncanny intervention. He showed me his pain in the way he cradled a broken flower I dropped beneath city lights, in the quiet trembling of his shoulders when night closed in. I didn't ask. I only watched, gathering fragments of who he was. A being ripped from realms beyond, once loved, betrayed, and cursed. A creature caught between worlds, unable to return, unable to remain. Our bond deepened not with conversation but with shared silence. In that void, the virus of intimacy bloomed. I began dreaming of his world of fire-scarred lands, constellations unknown, winds bearing distant echoes. I dreamt I stood beside him at the edge of nothingness. We touched, and I saw fragments of his past lifetimes, his crowning heartbreaks, stolen joys, and wretched endings. One dream brought me to a circle of blackened stones. I wore robes of ash and spoke an oath unheard. I trained my hand on his throat. The stones glowed. He fell. He didn't resist. My face was streaked with tears. He lay shattered. I did nothing to stop it. I jolted awake with a scream lodged in my lungs. My heart pounded like a cruel drum. I clasped my chest. I needed to see him. I needed to know who I truly was in this interwoven destiny. I raced to the rooftop before the sunrise, my heels clicking against empty halls. The sky was pale gold when I arrived. He stood facing dawn, motionless. I did not speak. I only laid my fingers over the scar on his throat, the echo of broken stone and grief and love. He reached up and took my hand. I held his fingers tight. That gesture said more than any confession. For a moment we were fragile, but not alone. We began to exist on the fringes of day and night. In daylight, I was the poised corporate air, untouchable, untarnished. In the dark, he was my protector, my shadow, my tether. I never learned where he slept. I only sensed his presence. When I awoke, I felt his heartbeat tangled with my own. I felt both safer and more vulnerable than I had ever been. He existed without explanation. I learned not to ask. Instead, I listened to silence. He responded with action. Before a key meeting, he would hover outside my door. After dangerous confrontations, a whisper of wind kept me from harm. I never saw him intercept a bullet or crush a rival in a secret fight, but the bruises faded. The whispers faded. I began to breathe easier. I taught him empathy in the corners of my solitude. He taught me rage, the kind born of centuries of being hunted, betrayed, and discarded. He taught me to be loud in rage, so I didn't have to be silent in sorrow. I realized rage doesn't always destroy it. Then came the memory that changed everything. It was night, and I watched him stare at the city's lights as though chasing ghosts. I closed the distance. Under my hand, I felt the lump in his chest as if he carried a second heart of pain. I had no words. I touched the hollow, felt the fracture. In that moment, I understood. His existence hinged on me. The closer I drew, the brighter my presence, but darker with cosmic recoil came the price. I clung to him, understanding the contradiction. What saved him might cost me, and what gave him warmth could burn me. Still, I leaned into him. I claimed the risk. I let myself be tethered to the impossible. We fell deeper. We began to weave a fragile love through shared silences, borrowed dreams, and stolen warmth. It was not tender. It was jagged, edged with threats we both refused to name. It was love, unruly and urgent. I loved the way his silhouette bent to shield me from rain and loved the ragged pulse in his voice when he whispered my name in dreams. I loved the way he became human around me, less demon yet more present, more alive. But our bond was not enough. I began to feel time cracking around us, as if the world itself knew something was out of balance. He grew quieter, slower, fading at the edges. It started with his shadow flickering unnaturally, no longer bound to his steps. Then came the dreams of mine, then his, of blood moons and collapsing stars, of a voice screaming through time, warning us of consequences neither of us could stop. He tried to hide it. I tried to pretend I didn't notice, but I felt it. With every breath, I felt him slipping, not from me, but from this world. He would disappear, not die something worse, erased, unwritten. The connection that once gave him strength was now draining him. The contract we never forged by hand was binding still, written in the invisible ink of past lives. We were repeating something ancient, a wound opening in the same place every time. The pain wasn't new, it was remembered. And then the final memory came. It arrived not like a dream, but a memory too heavy to ignore. I stood in a stone temple surrounded by robed figures. He knelt before me, chained by silver that hissed against his skin. I was the one who summoned the judgment. I was the one who ordered his sentence. My voice shaking, resolute, was the last thing he heard before his curse began. I had loved him once, and in betrayal, I had sealed him in a punishment so cruel, even death refused him. He didn't argue, he had accepted it. In that life I had been his lover, his undoing, his executioner. In this life I was his second chance. But the curse was not broken by love, it was fueled by it. The more I loved him, the more fragile he became. The more he loved me, the closer he drifted toward the void that waited to consume him whole. I should have walked away, should have saved him by forgetting him. But true love isn't selfless. It's desperate. It clings. I chose to stay. That choice had a cost. He began to vanish in fragments. First his reflection in mirrors disappeared. Then photographs. Then memories of him began to blur in the minds of others. My assistants no longer remembered the strange man who walked behind me. My security logs erased themselves. It was as if the world was trying to edit him out before he was fully gone. But I remembered. I remembered everything. He came to me one night flickering, ghost-like, his features distorted by a static I couldn't name. His eyes held a sorrow so deep I felt it in my bones. He pressed his forehead against mine. I could barely feel his skin. He was more wind than flesh, more memory than man. And then he was gone. No sound, no shattering light, no scream, just the smell of ash and rain. I was left standing alone in the middle of my garden, moonlight pouring over me like an accusation. I collapsed, my knees hit the earth, my breath fled me. He had severed the bond. He had chosen to disappear rather than watch me be consumed by the curse. He gave up his existence to spare mine. That was his one final devastating act of protection. I don't remember how long I wept. Time after that became a blur of obligations and hollow days. I lived mechanically. I attended meetings, signed papers, ate sometimes, slept rarely. I stopped returning to the rooftop. I stopped dreaming. But the world, uncaring, unyielding, kept turning. Seasons passed. I tried to rebuild a version of myself untouched by him. It was impossible. The scar he left wasn't physical, but it was carved into every second I endured without him. I stopped speaking of fate. I stopped seeking meaning. I told myself he was gone. But grief has a strange rhythm. It quiets, then roars. Every winter I would feel him again, a phantom wind through the corridors, the scent of smoke on my pillow, a pressure in my chest that pulsed at twilight. I began to hear music when none played. I began to dream again not of the past, but of a presence beside me. I couldn't see him, but I felt watched, cared for, protected. I visited the temple from my memories of what remained of it. Only broken stones remained, hidden deep in a forgotten forest. But I knelt before them and whispered his name to the wind. A name no one else remembered. A name that once held the weight of 1,000 lifetimes. I returned there every year, each time laying down a single black lily. I never prayed. There was no God who could understand us. I only remembered. Then came the snow. One year, on the first day of winter, I stood in my garden watching snow fall in quiet spirals. Something stirred in my chest, a pull. Not pain, not grief. Something older, something electric. I followed it. Through the silent streets, through alleyways shimmering with frost, through memories that surfaced with every step. I walked until I reached the river, where I once stood with him during a dream, a moment where our hands had touched without fear. And there he stood. Not as a demon, not as a ghost, but as a man. His eyes found me through the falling snow. He smiled, and it was both familiar and new. He looked different, warmer, more human. His shadow held weight. His breath fogged the air. He was real. He had returned. Not as the cursed creature from before, but as something reborn. He had chosen life again, even if it meant starting over, even if it meant mortality. He gave up eternity to return to me. We didn't run to each other. We didn't need to. We simply closed the distance and stood there under the sky that once betrayed us, surrounded by snow and silence. His hand reached out solid, trembling. I took it. We said nothing. We needed nothing. Everything we had been lover, curse, savior, executioner, it all blurred into something new. Something terrifying and tender. He had returned not because fate demanded it, but because he chose to. And me? I chose him. Again. Now we live in the margins of the world, in a quiet house by the sea where no one knows our names. We are no longer heirs and demons. Just two people with a shared history too vast to hold, and a present too precious to squander. He laughs more now, paints in the sun. I write again, not for others, but for myself. Sometimes I catch him staring at me like he's memorizing this life, afraid it might fade again. I reassure him with every breath, every glance, and every shared night under a blanket of stars. We speak little of the past, but sometimes when the moon is high and the wind howls like it remembers, he'll press a hand to my chest and whisper thanks into my skin, not for saving him, but for waiting. We both know this isn't the end. Fate may come again. The curse may awaken in another life. We may forget each other only to find one another again in the eyes of strangers. But for now we live. Not for revenge. Not for redemption. Just for love.